services there are relatively much less capable than, say, Russia, who, nobody would be surprised to know has been in the spying game for quite some time. So why did they stop me from going someplace? They could have basically snatched me and then put me on a boat and rendered me to whatever fate they thought was appropriate, and instead kept me in the place where it would be the most difficult for them to get me. And that's a question where I'm not sure we'll ever get an official answer, a written answer. But I think it's important to look at that and question why. Why would that be in the government's interest? What were they really trying to do there? One thing that's also somewhat, I think, less well known about that period was when it was leaked that I was considering going to Latin America, trying to find some method of getting there to depart Russia. And the Bolivian president, Evo Morales, had been at a diplomatic summit in Moscow to discuss a gas deal or something like that. He made publicly a claim where he said he'd be willing to consider granting me asylum. And this was when it was the issue of the day and the news was covering it. And amazingly, when his plane departed, and I was still stranded at Sheremetyevo Moscow airport, his plane was grounded. The airspace of, I think, 3 countries, Italy, France, and Spain, was closed to his plane specifically, which is actually a violation of international law because it's a diplomatic flight carrying a head of state. And he was forced to the ground. And when he got on the ground in Austria, the American ambassador was there, and there was a lot of things. And it turned out they wanted to search the plane to see if I was on board. So it was really, there were some unprecedented activities that happened to keep me from departing Russia.
We'll get off the subject of Moscow, but I just curious, do you feel safe there?
My thinking has really advanced. Anyone who sees the documentary will realize that, as you said, there wasn't a plan. My whole mission was to get this information back to the public. Once that was done, I didn't really think about what was going to happen to me. Everybody hopes for a happy ending, but I didn't plan it out. I didn't have this, great mastermind strategy. I just hoped for the best, and I hoped that the public would understand why I did what I did, and we could get a resolution that society as a whole would agree on. But to nowadays, as I've done more and more, and I've seen how people have responded to this, and how important our rights are to people, even when they're constantly coming under threat from new and new policies and prerogatives from government. And it's important for people to remember this is not just about the United States. Governments around the world are engaged in this kind of behavior, and we really have to push back. Is that if something happens to me personally in the pursuit of my work, that's something that I have to be willing to accept, or I'll never have the impact that I want to have. I have to be willing to take risks and accept the fact that, I'm one small guy. I'm an ordinary person in an incredibly unusual circumstance. And there's no way I'm going to be safe. But, the work is worth it.
Well, this is one of the questions that I had, and when we asked for questions from the audience they had, is about the work being worth it. And I think, people wonder how you feel about the incredible sacrifice you've made. Most people think that living in Hawaii with a high-paying job and a nice house and girlfriend, it might have been sort of nirvana, and you made an unusual choice. And so the question is whether it has been worth it and whether the country has responded in the way that's made it worth it. You've said at various points that your greatest fear would be that people wouldn't care and that there might be apathy in the face of these revelations. So are you feeling that you're getting the reaction that has made it worthwhile so far?
For me, it was never about, dictating outcomes. It was never about saying what would happen. It was about getting the information back to people so they could decide if it matters and decide if they care about it. And on that account, on that question, I think I could not have been more wrong in thinking that people wouldn't care. I mean, we've seen an extraordinary debate. All of the polling of opinions show that people care more about their civil liberties now than they ever have in the post 9/11 period. And it's because we thought about, these things and we realized they were possible, but they were abstract. They seemed a little bit like conspiracy theories. We didn't honestly imagine that, governments out there were collecting all of our emails, collecting all of our phone calls, and actually analyzing them to understand what we were doing. And when we found out that that was in fact the case, I think that changed the game for a lot of people. And since then, we've seen all of these reform bills proposed in Congress. We've seen bills already passed in the House. The judicial branch, which has for years and years and years said that, we can't decide these issues. We've got to defer to the executive branch on account of the state secrets privilege. And we can't actually discuss whether this is constitutional or not because it's simply too dangerous. But after seeing, the White House appointed review boards that had complete unrestricted access to classified information, and they found that, hey, these programs have actually never stopped a terrorist attack. They've never shown any concrete value at all. All the branches of government pay attention to this kind of thing, and society more broadly notices this. The very first open court to consider the constitutionality of these programs said it was likely unconstitutional. And this is after years of secret courts saying, we're not even going to consider the constitutionality of the questions. We're just going to approve the program. The President of the United States of America got up on stage and he said, we need to make reforms. We need to change the way this is done. And although he hasn't gone as far as, I necessarily think would be important, that's not my decision to make. And for him to say this is a debate that makes this country stronger, I think is very important for everybody who believes that our rights matter, that our Constitution matters, and that intelligence agencies, even if they have good intentions, can go too far. And when they violate the Constitution on a massive scale, that matters, and people need to be held to account for it.
I mean, it's interesting that you talk about how the president said this is a debate worth having, but meanwhile we had the national security community saying that these disclosures had just done egregious harm at first, and they seem to have backed off of that somewhat in more recent times. Have you noticed a little bit of retrenchment there?
I have. I've noticed it, and it's extraordinary. I think some level of explanation to that is the people making those statements were the officials who were personally implicated in authorizing the programs. When Keith Alexander, who oversaw, this massive unrestricted dragnet of Americans' communications being monitored, he said this will cause grave and irreversible harm to national security. But then he was pushed out of the agency and replaced with the new director of the National Security Agency, Michael Rogers. And he said, from his chair, and again, he's on top of the National Security Agency, he doesn't see the sky falling. This is not so serious. We will continue to do necessary work, and we will continue to succeed. And remember, I was an analyst at the National Security Agency on top of an engineer. I actually used these systems for monitoring targets. So I was aware, generally, I think much more so than the average commentator, about where the lines could be drawn and where would be going too far in exposing things that could actually cause real harm. And I tried my best to do that. At the same time, I recognize that nobody sees the full picture. I have my own biases. I am fallible. I could make mistakes and draw that balance wrong. And that's the reason I have never published a single document about the National Security Agency. I haven't revealed any news or new details. I've instead entrusted that to American journalists and said, look, you guys are the ultimate guardians of the public interest. When the system breaks down, you are the fourth estate that helps us right the ship. You veer us back on track. So what I want you to do is look at these, think very hard about what in these documents would serve the public interest for us to know, and what goes simply too far. And then beyond that, add an additional layer of checks by consulting with the government to ensure that maybe there's some information in those documents that you can't recognize the importance of, and give them an opportunity to say, hey, this will put some at risk. Don't print this. And in every single case where the government's presented some kind of compelling argument there, we've seen that happen. And in other cases where the government simply made an empty claim, the press has gone, we appreciate your input, but the public really needs to know about that. And I think that's the reason that the stories won the Pulitzer Prize for public service.
Have you, when you made this handover of the material to the 3 reporters that you chose to work with, did you discuss where you would draw that line, and have they at any point disappointed you of any of the disclosures from your standpoint gone too far? I know that I ask this because I think there was one comment that I read about from Bill Binney, who is a national security analyst, cryptographer, I think. You would know better than I. I'm just definitely in over my head on these issues. But he did say that he felt that some of the disclosures about
had gone too far. Yeah, I actually remember that quote. And Bill since then has said, the reporting that came out at that time was a little mischaracterized. And the way he had heard it was not quite accurate, because it was described as, I think as he heard it, as revealing penetrations the NSA had into Chinese military institutions and things like that. And that was in fact not accurate. It was about penetrations into public universities, into hospitals, into critical infrastructure that doesn't just put people overseas at risk, it puts Americans at risk. Because we've seen a lot of stories where some people would say it's about foreign spying. For example, there was one where it was found the National Security Agency used executive authorities. Those are authorities that are not authorized by law. They're simply the president says, let's do this, and they do it. To hack in to the private networks of American companies, which in itself is legally questionable, and provide themselves secret access to the networks of, I believe it was Google and Yahoo. It could have been other companies. But it's these kind of things where the NSA justified it as saying, well, these actions took place overseas, but they're affecting American companies on which hundreds of millions of Americans' communications transit every day. And it's happening without the awareness of Congress, because spying programs that happen that are authorized under executive authorities are not required to be presented to the congressional oversight committees. And, not everyone is aware about that. But that creates real blind spots in our methods of governance when it comes to spying. And if we don't know about that, if we simply say, because this happened outside the borders of the United States, we should never know about it, we're exposing ourselves to a lot of danger of intrusion and abrogation and erosion of our rights, because we live in an interconnected world. American communications do not stop at the border. You hit websites overseas, you buy services and products overseas, and your communications, even if they're going from Utah to Maryland, can actually travel all the way around the world before they make that trip. So we have to be really careful about how we draw that. And while the question that you asked more specifically was, do I agree with all of the stories that the journalists have presented? I don't. I would draw those lines a little differently, and I think much more conservatively than some of the journalists have had. But it's not my place to decide what should be published and what shouldn't. I mean, that is the role of our press and our representatives in Congress.
So in drawing the line, is your standard basically protecting lives, sources, methods, those kinds of those sorts of lines, or how do you? You have such an incredible mass of information. How would you decide where to draw the line between security and secrecy on it?
Well, the ultimate question is the public interest. Does this make a difference? Is it something that the public needs to know to make an informed decision about the policies and prerogatives of our government? If it's about secret programs that affect our rights, that affect our economy and things like that, that could cost American jobs, that could cost American lives, we need to be careful about how we handle that information. But at the same time, we have to know about some things if the trend is likely to cause more damage in the future than if we didn't know about it and allowed these programs to fester in the dark without our knowledge and consent.
It seemed like one of the issues that came up that's mentioned in the film that troubled you was the information you began to get about the U.S. drone program. Was there a particular tell me reason. Just I'm curious about what you saw that made you think that there were concerns people should have. Do you feel it's too secretive, and the public needs to have more buy-in to it?